Howdy readers, I'm Jason. This is Chapter and Verse, and this is the most recent video in my Cromwellathon project. Today, I am going to be talking about Bring Up the Bodies by Hilary Mantel, the second book in her Thomas Cromwell trilogy, and we're going to be focusing on the chapter called The Black Book. Now, the first thing, well really the only thing that I want to discuss is how contemporary and how relevant this thing feels politically, which I wasn't expecting. I also find it peculiar because this is it's kind of the middle chapter in the book, and unlike the middle chapter in Wolf Hall, which I felt like was the weakest, the Black Book seems to me to be the strongest chapter so far in Bring Up the Bodies. I feel like Hilary Mantel was kind of getting her footing back with the first third of the book, and this middle chapter feels much more like the prose from Wolf Hall. It feels sophisticated. It feels very much like clockwork. It is magnificent writing. But with respect to the politics in this thing, and not just the politics, but I suppose the kind of social framework of this story, we have a couple of different callbacks in this chapter to how things had been done before, right? How they'd been done in the past. And I won't go so far as to say that there's a kind of nostalgia for that operating in this section, but I feel like those passages work really powerfully in relief against how we see the social sphere and the political machine operating in the present in this chapter. But on 164 in the American edition here, Cromwell is remembering an old knight, right? K-N-I-G-H-T, that he had encountered. The guy was Portuguese. This is in Cromwell's youth. He was in Venice at the time. And the guy the knight just went on about how things had been done in the past. And it says here, in the old days, each tournament was a testing ground, right? Each jousting tournament, the tilt yard, as it's called numerous times in the books. There was no display of idle luxury. Women, instead of simpering at you from golden pavilions, were kept for afterwards. In those days, the scoring was complex, and the judges had no mercy on any infringement of the rules, so you could shatter all your lances but lose on points. You could flatten your opposer and come out not with a bag of gold, but with a fine or a blot on your record. A breach of rules would trail you through Europe, so some infringements committed, let's say in Lisbon, would catch up with you in Ferrara. A man's reputation would go before him, and in the end, he said, given a bad season, a run of ill luck, reputation's all you've got. So don't push your luck, he said, when fortune's star is shining, because the next minute, it isn't. Come to that, don't pay out good money for horoscopes. If things are going to go badly for you, is that what you need to know as you saddle up? So if we look at the present, right? So again, we have this call back to the past where rules were paramount. Following the rules was the most important thing. Whatever your bravado in the tilt yard with your armor on, that was less important than following the rules, than playing the game as it's meant to be played. And the Black Book, right, which is the title of this chapter, as we come to find out, is a codified manual for the safe running and keeping of a royal household. We first learn about the Black Book when there's a fire in Anne's room in the middle of the night, and apparently a candle had been left alight, or maybe not left alight, but maybe been set for nefarious purposes. Anyway, something catches fire. Anne is fine, but Cromwell talks to Henry about the need to amend the Black Book to make sure that there's always someone on hand to ensure that the candles are extinguished before the Queen goes to sleep at night, whomever she happens to be. So the Black Book then is this, it's a kind of rigid rule book, right? Like this is how the household of the king operates. And what I found really fascinating about her titling the chapter of the Black Book is the irony of it, because we have a kingdom, we have a court that is seems to be governed by caprice, by whim, and is changing the rules as it goes along, right? And so, what use is a rule book if you just alter the rules to suit yourself? And we see this today, right? So I can't remember exactly when it was. I can't remember exactly what the article was referring to. But I want to say this was, I don't know, maybe halfway through or a year into President Obama's second term. And I read an article in The Guardian about how Congress here in the States, there was something some congressman had been wanting to do. It was clearly unethical. So they just changed the rules. They changed the rules to allow them to do this unethical thing. Whatever it was, I can't remember again what it was. But, and I just remember thinking, like, they can't do that. But they did it. And in the intervening years, there have been so many instances of politicians doing that kind of thing, right? Changing the rules to suit themselves, changing the rules to make it easier for them to enrich themselves and to remain in power, et cetera, et cetera. And every time I read a piece like that, I just think to myself, they can't do this. This isn't right. But they do it. They continue to do it. They'll always do it. Here we have Henry flouting the the institution of marriage in his kingdom. And, so he throws over Catherine, and which we've seen, and marries Anne Boleyn. And now he's doesn't want to be married to Anne Boleyn anymore. He's essentially enlisted Cromwell to get him Jane Seymour, right? Whatever it takes, get me Jane Seymour. And, now, of course, if people want to get divorces, they just get divorces. But there at the time, Henry was, he was horny. He wasn't happy with the arrangements, and so he was like, all right, we're going to rewrite the rule book each time I find my eye wandering a little bit. And in that way, the book feels incredibly modern and incredibly relevant. There are other contemporary echoes here in the book too. So on page 205, 204 and 205, says this: in March, Parliament knocks back his new poor law. It was too much for the Commons to digest that rich men might have some duty to the poor, that if you get fat, as gentlemen of England do, on the wool trade, you have some responsibility to the men turned off the land, the laborers without labor, the sowers without a field. England needs roads, forts, harbors, bridges. Men need work. It's a shame to see them begging their bread when honest labor could keep the realm secure. Can we not put them together, the hands and the task? But Parliament cannot see how it is the state's job to create work. Are not these matters in God's hands? And is not poverty and dereliction part of his eternal order? To everything there is a season, a time to starve and a time to thieve. If rain falls for 6 months solid and rots the grain in the fields, there must be providence in it, for God knows his trade. It is an outrage to the rich and enterprising to suggest that they should pay an income tax only to put bread in the mouths of the work-shy. And if Secretary Cromwell argues that famine provokes criminality, well, are there not hangmen enough? And this seems to echo America today, actually. We've got people on the far right who are resentful of and bitter about the existence of social welfare programs. And they feel like, they feel like that, that if people aren't working, it's because they're lazy, which is not the case, right? Maybe like 1% of the time or something like this. And they don't want to be taxed to pay for these programs, because for them it's all about sort of picking yourself up by your bootstraps. And and it just seems to me a really callous way of looking at the world. And it's interesting to read in this novel that that maybe that callous way of looking at the world has precedent in centuries past, which I'm sure I always knew, but it's fascinating to read an example of it. Granted, it's a work of fiction, but as we know, Hilary Mantel has done her homework. And just a few pages later, on 208 and 209, we've got Cromwell musing on this kind of imaginary book that he calls the book called Henry. So Rafe Sadler has been called to serve in Henry's privy chamber. What is a privy chamber anyway? Are these just like Henry's right-hand men? But anyway, so yeah, Rafe Sadler is smart enough, he doesn't need to be told these things. But Cromwell kind of runs through them for us. We get a sense of an egomaniacal leader who is absolutely desperate to be flattered, to be given credit for things, even if he didn't come up with them. And if we look at just a couple of lines, right? Be sinuous in argument and allow him, Henry, escapes. Don't corner him, don't back him against the wall. Remember that his mood depends on other people, so consider who has been with him since you were with him last. Remember, he wants more than to be advised of his power. He wants to be told he is right. He is never in error. It is only that other people commit errors on his behalf or deceive him with false information. Does that sound like anybody else we know in the news? Just a few pages later still, we see this. It seems he will not name her. Anna Bolena, La Anna, the concubine. So if she harms the king, would it be the act of a good Englishman to remove her? The possibility lies between them, approached but still unexplored. It is treason, of course, to speak against the present queen and her heirs, a treason from which the king alone is exempt, for he could not violate his own interest. And when I read that line this time, now granted, I read this book back in 2012, but things are different now in 2020 than they were in 2012. In that line, a treason from which the king alone is exempt, for he could not violate his own interest. That line reminded me of that thing that Trump's lawyers said during the impeachment trial, that if Trump being president is in the best interest of the country, anything he does to remain president, to keep himself president, must also be in the best interest of the country. Even if that is speaking to a foreign power about digging up dirt on his opponents to give him an advantage in the election. And that's crazy, right? Like that's the logic of that is non-existent. And the logic of this is non-existent in much the same way, I feel. And then the last one that I wanted to bring up is just on 217, just a couple pages later still. But as you will be aware, the most part of England would rejoice to see the king free of her, of Anne Boleyn. And Cromwell says, I don't think the most part of England knows or cares. And I think he's exactly right? If we look at, every election in America, and we don't even have to just stay with America, right? What's it like in Britain? I'm not sure. But how many people actually vote? How many people actually take the time to educate themselves about issues and about candidates and examine their own consciences? Very, very few. Very few. And what's the biggest turnout we've ever had here for a presidential election? It's not very big. I'm going to guess 60% or something like that. Most people just tend to bury their heads in the sand. And it's not even really that, I suppose, right? Most people, I think, are just so preoccupied with their own lives. Understandably, because our lives can get crazy and we've got worries of our own, et cetera, et cetera. And oftentimes I think we feel like governments don't really touch us, and which isn't true, but it feels that way a lot. And so people just want to kind of take care of their own corner, I suppose. And that's essentially what Cromwell is saying of the average man and woman there in Tudor England, right? They couldn't give a damn about what Henry is doing with his wife and whether he wants a different wife and why, et cetera, et cetera. Like once it had been done, once the first domino had fallen, it was no longer novel. It was no longer this new thing. once Catherine had been thrown over and Anne had been introduced, Cromwell is saying that the people just don't care anymore, right? Maybe Henry would like to think that they all care. Maybe these nobles would like to think that all these people care, but they're really just taking care of their own lives, understandably. And that's basically it. That's basically all I wanted to say about the chapter on tonight's video. For next weekend, we are going to finish Bring Up the Bodies. So it's a bit more reading than we had for this week. I want to say it's about 160 pages. But yeah, so we'll finish Bring Up the Bodies for next weekend, and then we will start the last week to 2 weeks of waiting for The Mirror and the Light. And I wanted to tell you guys as well that The Guardian this weekend has published the first chapter of The Mirror and the Light. So if Bring Up the Bodies is a reread for you and you just can't wait to read the first chapter, or maybe this is your first time reading this book and so you want to bookmark that article where The Guardian shares that first chapter of the new book, I will put the link to it down below. There's also a new interview with Hilary Mantel in The Guardian this weekend, so I will link to that as well. I read that. I did not read the first chapter of The Mirror and the Light. I really mostly just want to see the table of contents so I can start planning my reading of that book. But as far as I can tell, it's nowhere online yet. So if any of you know differently, if any of you have seen the contents, the table of contents of The Mirror and the Light, please let me know. And let me know in the comments below how you're finding the book so far. I hope you guys had a great weekend. I had a lovely weekend. As I get older, I more and more appreciate that old Loverboy song, right? Was it Working for the Weekend or Living for the... I think it's Working for the Weekend. It's what we do, unless you're Steve Donahue, in which every day is work and weekend. Some kind of strange alchemy. But the rest of us, yeah, it's a lovely thing to have 2 days off where you can just read and just lay on the couch or sit in your chair and have a glass of wine and not worry about anything. So I will talk to you guys again very soon. Adios.